Yes, we're going to be in John chapter 18. Before we detoured for our Christmas story, for the Christmas season, we had finished. Jesus' time with his disciples is up. He shared the Last Supper with them, the Passover meal, in the upper room, and then on the way walking to the Garden of Gethsemane, he continued teaching them. He continued praying for them. So right now they are in the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, that where Jesus often went to pray alone. So they're all there together. The Jesus with his 11 disciples. Judas, if you remember, had already left during the Last Supper to go arrange Jesus' arrest. So in John chapter 18, we're going to begin in verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there is a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, was standing there with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now you'll see if you go and if you read the end of Matthew, the end of Mark, the end of Luke, each gospel gives us some details, some additional details about the arrest and the crucifixion of Jesus that other gospels didn't mention. Okay, John is the only one who mentions that the soldiers and the Pharisees and the priests who came to arrest Jesus fell to the ground when he uttered the words, "I am he." Does the phrase "I am" ring any bells for you from the Bible?
Yes.
Yeah. Where is that phrase?
It's I am is God, and it's throughout in several areas.
Yeah, specifically all through John. Yeah, the first use of the phrase "I am" or Yahweh came during the time of Exodus. Right? Moses, having been raised in the Egyptian court, when he's an adult, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And Moses steps in and does what? Kills him. So Moses is a murderer, and he runs to the wilderness. While he's out in the wilderness, he meets a priest living in Midian, a priest who honors God, and he lives with him. As Moses is tending the flock of the priest, he encounters the burning bush, right? The burning bush that burns with flame and yet never burns up. It's the presence of God manifesting himself to Moses. And God introduces himself to Moses with the words, "I am." Moses said, "Well, who are you?" And God, speaking to him from the bush, says, "I am the God of your forefathers, the God of Isaac and Jacob and Abraham. I am that I am." Yahweh. That's the name of God in the Hebrew language. And all throughout the book of John, the Gospel of John in the New Testament, John shows that Jesus repeatedly uses the "I am" statement to show his divinity to those who are listening. So, what are they coming to arrest Jesus for at this point? They've tried all throughout his ministry to trap him, to get him to say something that they could use to get rid of him. Do you remember at this point, what was it that Jesus said or did that crossed the line where they finally decided it's time to get him.
Is it because when he was saying he was God?
Yeah. He was making it clear, finally, in plain speech, I am. He equated himself with God. So they come to arrest him. And the soldiers who live in Jerusalem have heard about this man. They've known what's going on. They've seen the miracles and heard that 6 days previously he raised Lazarus from the dead. They come to arrest him, and then this man utters the phrase that Jews do not use because it's the holy name of God. They said, we seek Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, Yahweh, I am he, right? What does that tell you about the soldiers? That they back off and they prostrate themselves on the ground.
They understood.
They understood. They knew who he was claiming to be. And they gave such weight to his statement that they fell down on the ground in front of him. Now, whether they fell down in front of him because they recognized he was God, or whether they fell down in front of him prostrating themselves before God so that they didn't take part in that blasphemy, the Bible doesn't say. We do know that they recognized the importance of that statement, though. And if the soldiers recognized it, then you know the chief priests and the disciples and the Pharisees who were all present, they would have recognized it immediately.
May I ask one
Yeah.
question? I've never thought about this. Is this like could this be seen as like a foreshadow when Jesus returns? What people's reaction would be?
Yeah, because what does the Bible say is that every person on earth will do when he finally returns again?
They will bow to the knee.
Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. Yeah. No, I didn't make that connection, but yeah. So they've fallen down. They've fallen to the ground in front of him. So John 18, verse 7. So he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. So Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. He's asking for, arrest me, but you let my disciples go. Verse 9, this was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you gave me, I have not lost one. And if you remember, he prayed that in the very previous chapter. When he was praying to God, he said, I thank you, God, that I have not lost any of these that you have given me, except the one destined for destruction, the son of destruction, right? Judas. And we talked about that. So verse 10, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? So what is Jesus saying here? Put the sword away, yes. But what is he talking about here? Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?
He knew what was going to happen, and that's what God wanted. And
Yeah, he knew what was coming.
Peter couldn't do anything that was going to stop it.
Right. Jesus, even now, is teaching Peter. Why are you trying to interfere with God's plan? I've told you over and over this has to happen. Shall I not walk this path that God has laid out for me? John doesn't describe it, but do you remember what happens next with this servant?
Well, in another.
What happens? And if you read the Gospel of Luke, yeah.
Basically healed his ear.
Yeah. And Jesus reaches down, picks this ear up off the ground, puts it to the side of of Malchus's head, and heals it. These men who are coming to arrest him and kill him, and he heals him. For the rest of that man's life, him hearing correctly, what does he remember? He remembers what Jesus did for him, despite knowing what was happening, right? Mercy lasts forever. One other thing to point out here. How have you ever, oh come on, growing up, do you ever take sticks to your brothers and sisters and sword fight? Or just try and hit them with a stick?
Yes.
Me and my brothers bought lightsabers all the way up until I was in college and, beat each other up with them. I like to think that I'm halfway proficient with swinging a stick at someone. But how proficient do you have to be to swing a stick or a sword at someone's head and just clip their ear?
Really?
What was Peter's occupation? He was a fisherman. He was not a professional swordsman. Okay? So, do you think it was intentional that Peter just got the ear? Likely not. Okay, the swords they had then, they didn't have the kind of metallurgy. They didn't have, they weren't able to make real strong swords. And the average man like Peter would not have been able to afford, a professional centurion's sword. He would have had this little short, usually about 18-inch, what we call a gladius, right? It's for stabbing. It's for stabbing. That's the sword that the common man had access to at that point. He got the ear with a stabbing weapon. What was Peter's intent with that sword? In all likelihood, he was not aiming for the ear. In all likelihood, brash, reactive, non-thinking Peter, because that's who we know him as up to this point, he was trying to defend the life of God, the life of the Lord, the life of Jesus. He was likely not aiming for the ear.
But if he was a fisherman, he would have instinctively gone in that direction instead. But you're saying
How did
even
they-
though-
Well, let's run with this. Do we know how Peter fished?
With nets.
With nets. Yeah, and we know that for certain because over and over, Jesus, we see them throwing the nets over the side of the boat to haul in the fish, right? We have the poles and reels because we're advanced, right? No, they use nets in those waters, right? He'd have been strong as an ox. He'd have been strong as an ox. But whether he stabbed or whether he swung, he got the ear. Most likely, he was not just aiming for the ear, right? We know how Peter reacts.
Aiming for the chest.
I think he was aiming for the head.
Head.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just thought of that, but I didn't want to say it.
No, I mean that's when Peter reaches out to defend the life of Jesus, he's not just aiming to hurt someone. He's aiming to kill someone.
Get rid of him.
Yeah. And we'll see. We'll see this interaction between Jesus and Peter is going to continue throughout the rest of the gospel. Okay. So, Jesus in Luke, we see that Jesus heals this man, and then he berates Peter for, should I not walk this path that God's given me? So let's keep going. John chapter 18 and verse 12. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient for that one man should die for the people. Because remember, they're looking at this from a political standpoint, right? And the people are all swarming to follow Jesus at this point. They've thrown the triumphal entry where Jesus has come into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, the colt of a donkey. How do the people react? Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday. They all gather palm fronds and they wave them. They're hailing the king coming in. They take off their cloaks and they lay them on the ground like we do with red carpet because the king can't walk on the dusty ground. We're going to take off our cloaks for him to walk on, right? They were honoring him as coming king. And the Pharisees, If Rome sees us raising up a king, they're going to smash us. So they're looking to keep the status quo, right? So they go. That's why Caiaphas had said it'd be better for one man to die instead of for all the people to bear the wrath of Rome. That's where he's coming from. Verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" And Peter said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. While they were still having the Last Supper, Jesus told his disciples that you are all about to run away from me. You're all about to leave me. And what was Peter's response to Jesus? "I will never leave you, Lord." Right? So Jesus told him what? "You will, Peter. In fact, you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows." This is all taking place at night, right? They've had the Last Supper. They've had the Passover meal. They would have done that right around 6 p.m. And then they go to the garden together. They pray. And in the wee hours of the morning, around midnight, best historians can figure, is when this arrest and everything happens. So Jesus has told Peter, before the rooster crows in the morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. That was when they had the Last Supper together. And now Peter has denied that he knows Jesus. Verse 19. The high priest. Oh, one more thing. At any other point in the gospel, has John ever written, has he ever omitted the name of a disciple before when he's writing his gospel?
Well, when they were having the supper, the Last Supper, he referred to the disciples, the one whom Jesus loved.
Yeah. There's one disciple that John refers to in the third person. Not in the third person. There's one that John refers to without naming him, right? The disciple whom Jesus loved. Or here, the one that the high priest knew. In the old style of writing, you wouldn't name yourself when you were telling the story. Not when you were recording it for a historical purpose. John's not going to name himself. So he says, the disciple that Jesus loved, or the one that the high priest knew. So this is John's firsthand account, because he's the one who went in and knew the high priest and was able to witness what happened. So verse 19, the high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once the rooster crowed. The Gospel of Luke describes Peter breaking down and weeping bitterly once he hears the rooster. So it's now morning. Verse 28, then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So there is a law about the Jews not associating with or being one with the Gentiles, right? And if you entered a Gentile's house, which was considered the enclosed roof portion of the house, that was entering the house, you were unclean. That's why it was such a big deal when Jesus went and ate with the tax collectors and with the Gentiles, right? So they didn't go into the governor's house, but instead, in verse 29, Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." And the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. What was the Old Testament punishment for blasphemy or lowering the status of God? Because that's what Jesus had done in their eyes, right? Stoning. Yeah. The punishment for claiming that you as a human were equal to God was defined as blasphemy. You were lowering the status of God by making him equal with a human. And the punishment was stoning. The Jews were a conquered people, and Rome didn't let them carry out capital punishment anymore. Only Rome had the authority to put people to death. That's why they came to Pilate, right? So if the Jews had killed him, Jesus would have been stoned. But the Old Testament describes Jesus dying on a tree. That's why John wrote here, this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had said about what kind of death he was going to die. Verse 33, so Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is the truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. The other Gospels describe Barabbas as being a multiple times murderer, as being a thief, as being an insurrectionist, and John uses the word robber. Regardless, he was a criminal, right? Why did Pilate say he found no guilt in Jesus? Because Pilate's looking for a physical insurrection, right? He's looking for someone challenging the authority of Rome. And yet Jesus told him, "My kingdom's not in this world. My kingdom is spiritual. It's not here. Otherwise my people would be fighting your people." The Pilate doesn't quite understand what Jesus is saying, but he dismisses Jesus' claims as not being politically relevant. So he finds no Roman guilt in what Jesus has said. Any questions or thoughts on any of this from chapter 18?
I have a
Yeah.
So, even though he found no guilt in him, he kept him just to appease the Jews?
Yes.
And he had that power.
He did. Yep. We've actually found inscriptions that describe Pilate as being almost the Roman administrator of Jerusalem. So he was in charge of the city. The other, in Luke, we see that Pilate, John just said that Pilate went back and forth between the crowd, the Jews, and Jesus several times trying to figure out what was going on. In Luke and the other Gospels, we see that not only did he do this back and forth between Jesus and the Jews, but he also sent Jesus off to Herod, right? To try and pass the buck to Herod to deal with this political mess. And Herod, Luke describes, was curious about Jesus. He'd heard about him, and kind of mockingly tries to get Jesus to admit that he's, an insurrectionist. And that's when Jesus just doesn't answer. Herod questions him, but Jesus knows none of the questions are genuine. He doesn't respond. He stands his ground, stays silent. And his only response when Herod asks him, "So are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus again says, "You say that I am," and goes about his way. Jesus very easily could have talked his way out of this, because both Pilate and Herod wanted to let him off the hook. They didn't want to deal with this. And yet Jesus allowed himself to be put through this because he knew that was the only way that forgiveness was going to come to people. Over and over, he had outs. All throughout this night, all throughout this morning, he could have called a legion of angels, he said, to fight for him, but he didn't. He could have simply told Pilate, I have nothing against you. He could have told Herod, I'm not building an army against you. They both wanted to wash their hands of this, right? We also see in the other Gospels that Pilate's wife had dreams from God that Jesus was the Messiah and that Pilate should not kill this man. His wife told him, God has spoken to me and shown me that this man truly is who he says he is. Keep your hands off of him. So Pilate literally comes out and washes his hands. I find no guilt in this man. You do what you want to with him, you Jews. And so he hands Jesus over and lets Barabbas go free in Jesus' place. I'm going to read very quickly from chapter 19, and we will wrap up with that. So chapter 19 in John, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. But the Jews answered, We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you? Jesus answered him, You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So So they're blackmailing him now. If you release him, we know that you're going against the emperor. And when you have a mob standing outside your quarters trying to bring that against you, politically, he has no option, right? So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Jesus had an out. Pilate wanted to give it to him, and yet because of his love for Barabbas, for Judas, for us, because of his love for us, he allowed himself to go for crucifixion. The only way that we can love those around us is to recognize the love that Jesus showed us first. Any thoughts, questions? Let's pray. God, it's difficult for us to understand. It's difficult to me for me to understand how you could give up everything for me despite what I do, despite what I've done. Don't allow us to forget. Help us not to forget the importance, and the greatness, and just how incredible this sacrifice was. Help us not to dismiss this as a story, as a myth. Help us to see and live in such a way that we honor what you did for us. God, give us the words, give us the opportunity to share this truth with those who don't know it. It's impossible for us to think up the right way to tell this story to someone. It's impossible for us to craft a plan to show someone salvation. We know that nobody's going to hear the truth unless you're working on them. So God, we beg you to work on those people around us. Work on us. Make us into who you need us to be. And work on those people around us so that we can share the truth with them once we understand it, once we commit to it. And God, help us to commit to it. Help us to live our lives and walk in what you have prepared for us, and to set aside our own plans, our own desires, our own ambitions, in the same way that Jesus walked forward into this, knowing how bad it was going to be, begging you for another way, but committing to do it regardless. Help us to follow that example. We thank you, we love you for what you did, and it's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.